Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going to be talking about the subject that I know Chris and some of our listeners knew was coming, and that is the death of George Washington.
Yeah, Ray, you've said it over and over. You've been dying to talk about this episode. And so finally, we're going to resurrect this topic, one that you've been longing to hear. So I hope our listeners are ready for an earth-shattering podcast on not just death, but on Washington's death.
Yeah, I think Halloween probably should be my favorite holiday.
It should. But, it really is interesting because some people would say, all right, Washington, lived a great life, did well. He died. I mean, what can you spend an entire podcast on concerning his death? And Ray, I think that even today, you might say the mysterious significance, or not significance, but maybe the mysterious details of how he died, because it's not just clear cut, is it?
No, it's not clear cut. But I think one of the reasons we need to look at this particular topic as students of history is that, he was the first president of the United States. And, when a president dies, even today, that's a big deal. That's a major event. And I think when you're dealing with the first president of the United States and his death, that's even more important, even more than 200 years later.
And also you look at the medical that was behind it, and even how sometimes we can become so OCD about how we do things that it can cause us to not use common sense, which can ultimately cause us to have severe issues, especially with medical. And I think that's one of the things that happens here with George Washington, is he was so used to his routines and to his rituals, and it kind of caught up with him in December of 1799.
Yeah, and Washington hadn't been long out of the office. He left office in March of 1797. So it's a little over 2 years later when he dies. And this is going to be an interesting thing, because if you think about his presidency, at the end of his first term, he wanted to go home. He wanted to go ahead and retire, to walk away from this. The division was more than he wanted to deal with. And it's interesting that at that point, the Alexander Hamilton folks, the Thomas Jefferson folks, they didn't like each other. They couldn't agree with each other on much of anything. But on this, they could agree. George Washington couldn't retire at the end of his first term. He needed to stay on at least 4 more years. And so in 1797, he walks away from the presidency. And in 1799, he walks away from this life. And America is left to move forward without the man who has been central to its history up to that point.
And when he does walk out of the presidency, it's not like he walks onto the back of the veranda of Mount Vernon and just sit there and look at the pretty water and look at the trees, the change colors with their leaves. He does what he's always wanted to do, and that is manage the farm, to take care of. He had a massive operation there at Mount Vernon, as we've talked about before. And so when he leaves the presidency, he goes right back to work, goes right back to his farm. And you would find Washington out and about each and every day, surveying, working, tending to some aspect of the property. And on December 12th, on a Thursday, it's wintertime, and wintertime in Virginia is cold, and experience is kind of like that North Carolina weather. You never know what you're going to get. And I believe on that day, as he was kind of out there on horseback surveying and doing some work, there was some snow, there was some hail, there was some rain, and he was basically, he'd been out there in it. And when he finished up and he said, okay, I probably need to go on in, it was time for dinner. And that's one of the things about Washington, is he was very firm in being set in his ways. And, Washington was one who, when it was dinner time, he wasn't going to keep anybody behind. He was, it was time to eat. The cooks had spent a lot of time preparing the food. The family was all gathered in the room, and he was not going to let a moment's notice, pass without him sitting down and going to eat, because he didn't want to keep others at waiting. So on this night, they said, sir, or, George, or whatever they called him, they said, dude, you're soaking wet. You are just, go change. And Washington was like, no, it's important to me that we stick to our schedule. It's important that we have this time together. And so he goes and eats dinner while he is still soaking wet. And Ray, one of the first things we want to do when we come in from the rain, such as what we had the other day when it is raining, extensively, is we want to get out of those wet clothes and we want to put on some comfortable ones. But known for his punctuality, Washington decides to eat while wet, and that will really kind of catch up to him.
Yeah, the warning signs were already there. You talk about he's, someone that wants to keep to schedule, and that's certainly true of George Washington. He was a stickler for the schedule and for doing things a particular way. But the warning signs, the red lights were already flashing, in that on that day, he's already experiencing a runny nose. He's already experiencing some hoarseness. He's already experiencing a cough. So there's already signs that something's going on. There's already signs that, he probably had I don't know that this is in any of the sources. I haven't seen it. He may have already been running a fever. But he goes out that day and he spends all day, as you said, on his farm, doing doing not just simply a job, but doing what he loved to do. And he goes out, and like you said, he comes home, and he doesn't change out of those clothes. And just to tell you, Chris, how cold it was, the last diary entry or journal entry that Washington enters, it's December 13, 1799. Late at night, he writes in his journal, and a lot of times in Washington's journal, this is the kind of thing he records, quote, Mercury at 28 at night, end quote. That's it. That's the last words George Washington will write for history, is Mercury at 28. But it shows how cold it was. And like you said, he comes in, he's got to be freezing cold. He's soaking wet, and he sits down at the table. I wonder what they were eating, but he sits down at the table to eat, and he doesn't change his clothes. And then he goes to bed. He goes to bed. I assume he changes clothes before he goes to bed, but he goes to bed, and that's going to be when the problems are going to soon begin.
Yeah, but even then, having experienced all of that, when the next morning comes about, he gets back up and goes out to work again. He goes back into the fields. I remember reading something where even though he didn't feel good, he still had something to do. And so he actually went to, I think, the east side of Mount Vernon, where there were some trees that needed to be cut down. And he heads over there, and, he starts talking to the enslaved people, and he starts marking out, these are the trees that need to be, done. And people begin to notice something about him. They notice, his voice becoming a little more hoarse. They notice that he's a little bit, more tired. But yet Washington still completes a full work day, even not feeling well, which, once again, it's just he models ethics, work ethic. He models, this is a job, but I enjoy doing it. But this is important. I've got to keep the things going, because he wanted the people to still have things to do, to still keep going. So, he goes back to work, and then that night he comes back in. And at that night, as you mentioned, then other people start noticing that, wait a second, something's going on. And that includes, his secretary, also very important confidant, Tobias Lear. But most importantly, Martha starts to catch wind of something and notices that Washington's not well, and becomes to be concerned.
Yeah. And he goes to bed, like I said, he writes in his journal, Mercury at 28 at night. And by the way, let me just stop for this observation, Chris. I admire the fact that here you have George Washington, first president of the United States, hero of the American Revolution, one of the most popular figures in early American history. I can relate to this. He's going to write in his journal, and that's all he writes. It's like if I was to keep a journal, that's how it would be. It's like, well, the dogs were sleepy today, or something like that. It wouldn't be. You would think there was going to be great thoughts, and he does. But on that last night, Mercury at 28 at night, but he goes to bed. He and Martha go to bed there at Mount Vernon, and he wakes up around 2 o'clock in the morning. And Chris, I don't know about you, but I think it's always true. And maybe you have an answer or an idea here, but it seems like the worst medical things happen in the middle of the night. When you wake up, it's always in the middle of the night. You wake up, and that's when something's hurting, something doesn't feel right. It never happens in the middle of the day, at least not for me, when the doctor's offices are open.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, but the one thing that he had going for him is it did happen in the middle of the night, and Martha's aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
And Martha is wanting, I mean, she doesn't think, oh, you're just not feeling well. I mean, she is concerned, and she wants to get help immediately.
Yeah, and some women in our audience may say, well, he's just a typical man because he was sort of reluctant to bother people. But he's coughing, he's having shortness of breath. And like you said, she calls for Tobias Lear, his chief aide, good friend of Washington's. And he comes in, and as you said, Chris, he takes one look at Washington, and this isn't good. This is not going to be good. And he calls in a personal physician of George Washington, a guy called Dr. James Crack. I may be mispronouncing that name. But I mean, when you go from the very early morning hours of December 14, 1799, and you proceed through the day, more and more people are coming in. And we'll talk about who some of these people were, but more and more people are coming in. He's getting more and more attention, but his condition continues to worsen. In fact, at one point, I believe he looks at someone in the room. I believe it was a Dr. Crack, and this was around 5 o'clock. I believe it was that morning. It may have been that afternoon. But he said, I believe from my first attack that I should not survive it. So things are going downhill rapidly through the early morning hours of that day, December 14, and they are going to continue to go down rapidly throughout the day. But he's going to take care of business, Chris. He's not just going to, even though he's having trouble breathing, he's having to sit up so that he can breathe. But he's still, he's working out his final will. He's concerned about people around the bed. He's still doing what he thinks he's supposed to do.
And I think there's a couple of things to go along with this also, and that is before the doctor arrives, Lear had sent for another guy who's like the overseer at Mount Vernon, George Rollins. And George kind of comes in before the doctor comes in. And here's the problem that sometimes we have is you've got people who think they know all that the doctor knows and begin prescribing treatments and options and things of that nature. And so while waiting for the doctor's arrival, Rollins says, sir, I think the best thing for us to do in this situation is to bleed you. And that is when they would remove blood from the individual, because back during that day, many people thought that your ailments and your illnesses were all found in blood, and you get rid of some of the blood and then the new blood comes in, and that would kind of help you. And so he says, what I'd like to do is bleed you. And that could be through leeches and through other things. They would draw blood out of you. And Martha pretty much is adamant that George Rollins doesn't do this, and voices concern about it. But George, is like, listen, I've had this done before, and it actually worked. I'm good with it. And so they bleed, I think, like a half a pint of blood. And while they're bleeding a half a pint of blood, Rollins, not a doctor, but Rollins also says, hey, my mama told me that if you have a mixture of molasses and butter and vinegar, and if you drink that, it will kind of soothe your throat. And so he is having blood drawn. He's drinking this mixture, and they said that that mixture was so difficult to swallow, which anything to me with vinegar in it is difficult to swallow, but that he almost suffocated while trying to drink that and have the blood removed. So, before the doctor gets there, here's people trying to help him. I mean, I know that they had the best intention because it had worked before, but I wonder, Ray, if that didn't kind of accelerate the rapidness of Washington's demise.
Yeah, I mean, we now know things that they didn't know. For example, where's a lot of the immune system? It's in the blood. And he had an infection, and we'll get to this a little later, but he had an infection, and there they are draining blood. And Chris, you talk about, the pint of blood that was drained that morning, but throughout the day, they're going to drain large amounts. Even once the doctors get there, I think it was 40% of his blood or something close to that, that they drained from him throughout the day, probably weakening him so that, the infection was able to take over even more, but definitely making it harder for him to, making it harder for him to have the energy he needed to continue to fight the infection that was going on. And you mentioned the mix of molasses, vinegar, and butter, but there was also a patch, not a patch, but a cloth they put on his throat to try to burn. I mean, the medical treatments that they gave Washington at that time, and were pretty common for late 18th century. I mean, it borderlines on torture. I mean, the man is dying. There was probably very little they could actually do for him at this particular point, at this time in history. But I mean, they are just, in trying to help him, they are just absolutely torturing him. And what so Chris, we need to talk about, I think, a little bit what was going on with Washington. What was the problem? The main problem, it seems to be, was shortness of breath. I think the sort of running idea then and now is that he died from a swollen epiglottis. That an infection, a bacterial infection, had got in there, and that everything. That's why he couldn't lay back. He had to sit up because that epiglottis would shut off his airway. So they brought in a guy by the name of Dr. Dick, and he is going, and he has a new treatment, there's a new treatment called a tracheotomy, where they would cut at the lower part of the throat and open up the airway. And there were some people there, Chris, who wanted to do this. They thought this is a good idea, but Dr. Dick wouldn't do it because he knew, if he cut George Washington, Washington's conscious, he's already struggling to breathe. This isn't a prime situation to try a technique that at this particular point in time was relatively new. If Washington died, he would go down in history as the doctor who killed George Washington. So they don't do it.
But it also, and I think that illness that is suspected, I think they called it, and some people might know it today as like the croup or something like that. And, something that's still familiar to us. But it needs to be said that there wasn't just one physician. That as serious, as this continued to develop, ultimately, I think there's 3 physicians that are called in on this. Even the most trusted doctor said, whoa, this is out of my hands. Because what you said, I mean, you've got the first president who is not just now on his deathbed, but it's happening so fast. He just the day before, he was riding his horse. It wasn't but a few years he was leading our country. I mean, this is happening very, very quickly. And so you want as many people and as many solutions, to which you're right. It's like an experiment. Well, throw this at it, throw that at it, everything but the kitchen sink. I mean, they give them an enema. They do everything that they possibly can. One of the things they thought, well, if we can just get them to vomit up. So he's trying to vomit all of this stuff up. They're taking 40% of his blood out. Well, the man is just being weakened minute by minute by minute, to the point, as you said, Washington knows his body and knows it better than anybody else, where he knows that literally life is being drained out of him. And what I find remarkable in all of this, and I haven't done all the research that you have on Washington, but I don't find him complaining. I don't find him saying, guys, you're doing it wrong. I don't find that. I find him at the will of the ones that he entrusted knew what they were doing. And whether that be Mr. Rollins, his overseer, whether it's Martha, whether it's these three doctors, that Washington, the leader of the country, the leader of the Revolutionary War, that the president of the Congress, I mean, all of these things. And in this moment of life and death, he sits back humbly and allows people to do their job.
Yeah, he does. And it's quite amazing because he doesn't complain. At least we don't have any record of him really complaining. I mean, he does move around trying to get comfortable, but um, the primary sources, one of them from Lear himself, he's thanking the doctors for their trouble. And one of the things I wanted to mention is his valet, who was a slave by the name of Christopher Shields, stands by the bedside, and Washington notices that he's been standing up for a long time and tells him to have a seat, sit down, take a load off type of thing. And but he's very concerned about the people around him, the people in the room. He's not complaining like I think I would be, but so I mean, it says something very, very interesting about the man, that here he is in this situation, and he's not complaining. He's thanking the doctors, and he's also very concerned about what other people are going through in the moment. And Christopher Shields, by the way, very quickly, just before I leave him, he was one of 4 slaves in the room when George Washington died. And George Washington's actually going to die around 11 o'clock that night, December 14, 1799. Shields is one of 4 slaves in the room. And when Washington dies, he's the one that goes through the pockets, making sure all this pockets stuff's been taken out and stuff. And he gives all that stuff to Lear. And what the real shame of that whole situation with Shields is that he was not freed. Washington freed his slaves in his will upon the death of Martha, but not Christopher Shields, because he was one of the slaves that belonged to the Custis estate, so he couldn't free. And Shields, even after this service for Washington, is not freed, and is actually, goes down to one of the grandchildren of Martha. So sort of a sad aspect of the story, I think, somewhat of a tragic aspect of the story.
Yeah, there's a famous painting of Washington's final moments. It's called "The Life of George Washington, the Christian." I found that interesting. That was done, and you see those people that were in the room where it does happen, and I do think that it's interesting, that he was there, but also it's interesting that Washington, you mentioned that he had said, "I knew as soon as I got sick that this was the end." But I think there was a moment, I might have this wrong, I couldn't find the quote, but he said something like, "I die hard," or something like that. Yeah. I mean, that because they've consulted all these physicians that, they're trying all of these things. And, he said something like, "I die hard, but I'm good to go if it's time." Yeah. That was not his words. I'm paraphrasing that, but that he understood that when the time came, it would be time. But he then felt it important to get all of his papers together, as you mentioned, the wills, the pockets, and, all of these things. But he had I know his diary had the last words that he wrote, but his last words spoken were pretty intriguing also, weren't they?
Yeah, his last words were "'Tis well."
Yeah, and before that, didn't he ask, he wanted to be like decently buried? And I'm curious, you're the historian on Washington, but he said something like, don't don't put my body in that vault in less than 3 days after I'm dead. And I've always found that interesting because, well, why was he so adamant that it had to be 3 days after he was dead? Why not put him in the vault? Do you have any understanding
Yeah.
on that?
Washington had a fear of being buried alive. That was
Okay.
actually one of his fears, which wasn't an unnecessary fear in the late 18th century. I mean, I'm sure
Right.
it happened. So it was the idea of, keep me out until you're sure,
So make sure I'm dead.
before you put me in that coffin and put me in that tomb, let's make sure that I'm dead. But he also didn't want a parade or large funeral. He wanted a private funeral, which of course wasn't going to happen, but that's what he wanted. But he does, going back to what you said, he does say, look, I think he says at least twice, probably more than that, I'm not afraid to die. Which brings us to another issue related to Washington's death, and that is his religion. Washington has been, and I'm going to use the word accused, of being a deist by a lot of historians, and I don't think he was. He certainly wasn't an evangelical. He certainly wasn't someone who, had a very open, expressive faith. But I don't think he was a deist per se. But one thing they do point to is that despite his faith and all that, in the end, he doesn't call in a pastor. He doesn't ask for there to be a pastor. He doesn't ask for any Bible reading or anything like that. And that is an interesting idea, that here he is dying, admitting he's not afraid to die, saying "'tis well," but at the same time, he doesn't call in a pastor.
No, he doesn't call in a pastor, but they sure do call in 4 of them to do his funeral.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. They covered it on that point.
I mean, they did, because I think they had like the church, the Christ Church. I think they had the Presbyterian. I mean, they had quite a few that were going on there as well. So he might not have called one in the room, because honestly, I think he was secure in his faith. I mean, I think that's very, very true, regardless of how people want to view the founding fathers and their views of religion. I still go back to, they were adamant about a separation of church and state. And I just think in their roles of leadership, right, they had their faith, but they also kept their faith private, and they kept their leadership of America public. And whereas today we see a lot of people who want to marry those two things, I honestly think because of the role of the church during this time, which was not necessarily a good thing, the Church of England, the Anglican Church, I mean, it wasn't a good thing. So I think you had Catholics, you had all of these people. And so I think they were doing the right thing. And I think the right thing was, my faith is going to be over here. My leadership is going to be here. I'll let the priests do their job, and I'm going to do the job that I'm called. And I respect that. I've always respected Jefferson and Washington, those two especially. Adams really doesn't dwell too much into that, but those two, because they have helped society today. And that's a whole nother podcast about the role that religion plays with society. But Ray, with all of the different religions that were in Virginia during the time, if Washington would have been so focused on one direction, a lot of people might not have truly followed his leadership.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think one of the reasons Washington didn't call for a pastor is related to something we've said earlier. He was very concerned about the people around him. It's possible, I don't know this is fact, I speculate it's possible he just didn't want to bother anybody. But I think also it's likely, as you said, that he was secure in his faith, and he wasn't necessarily thinking, he didn't think it was necessary to bring somebody else into that. So George Washington does pass away around 11 o'clock p.m. on December 14, 1799. He's in his early 60s. When he dies, they do wait 3 days before they inter him on December 18, 1799. What I find interesting, Chris, is they have this very large funeral, contrary to his wishes. Martha does not attend. She stays up in the house. She's too overwhelmed with the emotion to attend the funeral. and they bury him in the old tomb. Eventually, of course, he's moved to the new tomb where his body and the body of Martha and others is currently housed. And there was talk at one point, I think, Chris, about moving him to the Capitol. Now, this was, way back then.
Right.
But that was never done. He was left there at Mount Vernon, which I think is something he probably would have wanted.
Yeah, I was just thinking through this 3-day thing. We were talking about religion.
Mhm.
It was the Christian aspect of 3 days. I'm not going to presume that there was something there, but it is very interesting that maybe the 3 days and in relationship to Jesus Christ and the resurrection, that maybe that did have something to do with it. So, Washington, even after all these years, is still a very complex individual, even in his death. He said a lot of things, but some things, because he kept so quiet, he left you thinking. So that's just another curious aspect of his life.
Yeah, when Washington, I'm going to stop on this. When Washington died, Martha Washington's in the room. And she says, quote, "'Tis well, all is now over. I shall soon follow him, and I shall rejoice when the moment arrives. I have no more trials to pass through." And she didn't live much longer. What did she die? About 2 years later?
I think so. And I want to, and I might be wrong on this, but when I was at Mount Vernon doing a little seminar thing, I want to say that one of the people that were there is kind of like an expert on Washington, also said she never slept in that same bedroom again. Is that right?
Yeah, she moved upstairs. She moved. The bedroom was on the second floor, but she moved to a different room on a different level.
And left it just like it was, right?
Left it just like it was.
Yeah. And she grieved hard, didn't she?
She did. Matter of fact, and I'm going off the top of my head here, but Thomas Jefferson is going to visit Mount Vernon. I want to say it's 1801 when he does visit. And she doesn't take it well because, of course, Jefferson and Washington sort of parted on not so good terms. And Jefferson had written some bad stuff, and Martha had taken it sort of personally. And she got really upset when he visited. She wouldn't see him. She kept her distance from him. This was a woman who, I don't know if they were quote unquote in love when they first got married, but they were definitely in love when he died. Because she grieved a long time.
Yeah, it's a tragic story, but it's also a very beautiful story of the devotion and love that not only Washington and Martha had, but go back and look at that painting and look at the people that were in the room and how those people did everything they could for their friend.
Yeah,
because about them.
Yeah, Chris. I think this episode turned out to be more gloomy than I had expected. I'm not sure what I was expecting. It's what I wanted.
Yeah.
No. Anyway, thanks for indulging me with this particular episode. I hope our listeners learned something about the last hours of George Washington. Please share this podcast with your family and friends, folks. That's how we get the word out about history you didn't know but should, by sharing the link, by sharing podcasts, the podcast link, sharing the Facebook links, getting the word out about this episode. As always, if you have episode ideas, comments, questions, please feel free to contact us on Facebook, or you can email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know @gmail.com. The podcast is available on Spotify, Anchor, Amazon, Stitcher. It's available basically anywhere you can get your podcasts. So no matter what a person uses to listen to their podcasts, they can most likely find us on that platform. And we like to keep our episodes relatively short. Chris, I know sometimes I listen to podcasts in like 2 hours long. But we like to keep them around 30 minutes. So that way, if you're going to work and you got to drive, you can listen to one episode on the way there. Chris, I was talking to someone the other day, and they said that the past few days they had found our podcast and said they go to sleep every night listening to us. I was like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. But anyway, We do enjoy the podcast, and we hope you'll continue to listen. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We'll talk to you later.